So we're talking this month about messaging and movements. And this is exciting for me because as we're talking about how we message in movements, it aligns with what we're talking about on our monthly training call, which is cross-sector partnerships. And so as you think about how we can connect with people across our communities, you've seen this slide before. This is how we think about how we can connect with our communities because what's represented in this graphic is the people who are on the ground. These are the small dots are actual people on the front lines of serving marriages or supporting those who support marriages in 11 different sectors of our communities. We certainly need to begin with the local church because it is the local church that's uniquely passionate and positioned to be working to strengthen marriages. And the faith sector is always the most important sector that we engage, but we can definitely engage with sectors all across our community. But it's important to think about the language that we use as we engage people across the community. And it's also important to realize that large scale social change requires broad cross-sector collaboration, not the isolated intervention of individual organizations. We're simply not big enough as small little nonprofits. We're not big enough to reach as many marriages as exist across our community, and especially the varied, unique ways that marriages present themselves. So we need to be working broadly across our communities, but we also need to realize that there's certain language that moves those communities forward because movements are about mobilizing people around shared purpose. And a broad movement to advance a marriage movement in a community is advanced when we mobilize people around this common identity and common shared purpose, which is marriage. Essentially, what we're doing by using our language is we're putting latent energy into motion. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people in our community who are longing for something meaningful to do in their life. There are hundreds of people in our communities who are deeply passionate about marriage. They just don't know what they can uniquely do. What's their highest and best role to play? But moving people into action requires language. It requires language that moves people to action. And that's what we're going to talk about today specifically is the unique language that we use inside of movements. But we're going to begin by talking about institutions. And why is it? It's because most of our human experience, most of our lived experiences have been lived within and around the world of institutions. Think about it, our schools, our healthcare systems, all our governmental systems. So many of the things that are how we experience life have been experienced in the context of institutions. And institutions have a certain language that they use to advance their mission. But what happened in the year 2000 or slightly before is this thing called the internet became a thing. And through the power of the internet, we've become a much more networked world. And I think it's important to realize that. And these are a couple of books you don't need to read, but certainly these are things that really highlight the growth of the network world. Now, we're not talking about one of these to the exclusion of other because we need our institutions, but we also want to leverage the networks that are available to us. And networks are important because networks help to expand the opportunities for learning and problem solving and decision making and personal interaction. Networks are powerful as we advance our movement. So let's talk just briefly and let's contrast institutions and networks or movements. So you all know this. Institutions are hierarchical. They're very centralized. They're very expensive, but also very powerful to create action. Networks typically are a place of very high control, and institutions are organized with intelligence at the center. Movements or networks are very different. Movements are networked. They tend to be very decentralized. They are very low cost, yet still powerful. There's a low degree of control. What's interesting with movements is that the intelligence is at the edges, and that's kind of comes from the world of network science. And it's the intelligence that's at the edges, which is really key to what we want to get mobilized in our communities. We know that our work is nationally informed because there's over 500 organizations that create resources for marriage. but our work has to be locally driven. And why is it? It's because people in local communities are closest to their problems and they know best how to overcome them. So to be a marriage movement leader in the community is to use language that mobilizes people in that way. So we're going to talk about institutional versus movement making language. And you guys have, I know, have heard this before, but it's worth reminding ourselves. You've heard the story of a fish. A fish swims up to another fish and says, "How's the water today?" And the fish says, "What's water?" And uh, and you've heard it said, differently, like, "Does a fish know he's swimming in water?" Well, I bring that up because we are saturated in the world of institutional language. Our muscle memory, our default is to use institutional language, but we're not leading an institution. You're not leading a marriage institution, you're leading a marriage movement. And so, just because very reflexively our um, our language tends to be institutional, it can actually defeat our chances of really making progress. So we're going to talk about three components. We're going to dive really deep into the components that make a movement message really effective. And that is to understand the core, the context, and the calling. What's the core message that we have to communicate to our movement? What's the context that we're communicating to? And what are the people that are inside of that context? What's their calling? So I'm going to go back to this same slide that I started with. This is our movement. This is what our movement looks like. So the core message is the message that we communicate across the entire movement, but the context falls within these yellow circles, and then the calling drives deeper into the unique small red and blue dots that exist here. So let's talk about what a core context and calling message is about. So the core message is what we naturally talk about. It's the things that we say in our work in our world every day. Why marriage matters. Why is marriage ministry important? Why should we use the local church as an important instrument? And why is marriage important to children? These are all part of the core message. This is part of the message that we communicate to everyone. But as we're communicating the core message, we need to adapt that message to the context of the sector that we're speaking to. And so we have to remind ourselves, what is the context of, of the message when I'm speaking to the healthcare community? And inside that community, what is their native language? And even beyond that, what are the mannerisms and social standards of that unique context? We need to adapt our core message to the context with which we are speaking to. But ultimately, we want to drill deepest into the calling. In other words, the person I'm communicating to or I'm writing to or a small segment of the population we serve, what's the role that they play? And inside of that role, what are the unique natural motivations that drive them? Because that's important because motivations are the key to energy, and movements operate on energy. It takes energy to move people to action. And so you're asking what's important to them? What will move them to action? We've got to get deep into the unique calling of the person. So I'm going to unpack this three ways just to kind of show us how that plays across different sectors. So as we think about the five callings or the roles that someone can play in the family law sector, well, there's a family law judge, right, working in that sector, and then the family law attorneys, and then the pro se attorneys. Every county has a pro se attorney that represents people who don't have representation. And then even the court clerk plays an important role. There's a unique calling for them. Even at the courthouse while you're there, you can talk to the marriage license desk staff. They're a key role that you can empower. And so as you think of just inside of the governmental or family law system, there's five different roles. But what's interesting about these roles is they're driven by different natural motivations. And that's why you got to drill down into the unique calling. Because for a family law judge, their highest motivation is a efficient and effective and fair court system, right? They want to move the docket. They want to clear their docket. Well, that's kind of the opposite motivation of a family law attorney because the goal of a family law attorney is to generate hours of billable time, right? And so they want to slow the process down. So you got different motivations that are at work. Pro se attorney, they're overwhelmed with people who have no representation. They just want to get people in and out of their office. A district clerk, kind of the same thing. Everyone in these different roles, even though they're all working in the family law sector, are driven by different motivations. So now let's break this down even further. Let's drill down into the unique calling of a senior pastor. Now, what's the core message to a senior pastor? The same message: why marriage matters. We're communicating that to everyone. But the context is the faith-based audience, right? So we can use language that's faith-based. We can point to the power of God at work in our lives, and we can use that context safely. And then the calling of a senior pastor. What's the unique calling? Well, they'll tell you they love marriage, their marriage is important to them, but they're called to evangelism and discipleship. And so you need to speak to that unique calling in order to move them to action. Now let's move to a completely different sector. Let's move to the healthcare sector. When you're communicating to a pediatrician, what's your core message? It's the same: why marriage matters. But the context now is different. It's an evidence-based healthcare world. And even the mannerisms and the conventions of how people talk to each other, how people interact with each other, very, very different. It's very professional. We call each other colleague. We don't call each other brother and sister. We're a colleague. And so the context really matters. But it's not till you drill down into the that's the context. It's not till you drill down into the unique calling of a pediatrician that you can really think deeply about how to move them to action. So for a pediatrician, what's their highest and best role to play? It is the fact that in their daily practice, they meet young couples who are having their first child. And in having that first child, the pediatrician knows the marriage of this couple is getting ready to change. There's a highest and best role. No one can speak into a young couple the way the pediatrician can. And until you empower that pediatrician or at least give them vision for what's possible in their calling, until you speak to that, you don't move that latent energy into motion. So as I close, I just want to talk about how we've communicated with senior pastors in the past. You know, when we think of the core messages with senior pastors, certainly it's why marriage matters, and the context is the faith-based sector. But I remember writing a very effective letter to senior pastors in 2017 because we had just finished a Weekend to Remember event, and I wrote to our pastors in our area that just celebrating that more than 1,000 people have gathered. And in fact, during that weekend, 81 people gave their life to Christ. And more than that, even more than that, 256 people recommitted their life to Christ. And so I asked this question: was that a marriage event or an evangelism event? Because I don't know, Pastor, of a single day in San Antonio when 81 people uh, receive Christ and 256 people recommit their life to Christ. And so what we're doing is we're tapping in the unique calling of a senior pastor. While he may not be moved into motion around marriage, if you can reframe it, see, this is a powerful reframe. If you can help him reframe it around the fact that no, this really advances what my calling is, then you're more likely to move them to action. So thank you for letting me share that with you today, and we'll talk more about it.